I wish you could see what I see when I look out at you all. It is truly amazing. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to close out this session with talking about something that's not about tech. It's barely about climate. It's about the fact that everyone here, all y'all in here, out there watching this, need to engage everybody who's not in this room or watching this in some new ways. And nowhere is that really more important or impactful than companies engaging with youth culture. And so really excited to have down at the end my old friend and returning champion, Patrick Flynn, Senior Vice President and the Global Head of Sustainability at Salesforce, and my new friend, Alexandria Villaseñor, who is the founder and executive director of Youth of Earth Uprising International. First of all, thank you so much for being here. Alexandria, let's start with you. Talk a little bit about, first of all, you've been an activist since you were 13. You're now 17. You started this organization. Talk a little bit about what you do and just a little bit about what brought you there.
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for having me, and I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation. And to answer that question, I got involved when I was 13, and before I got involved in climate activism, I actually didn't know much about climate in general. What happened is I've grown up in Northern California my entire life, but I moved to New York City in 2018, and I still went back and forth, though, quite a bit. So after a trip back home, in Northern California, I was here when the Camp Fire happened in Paradise, California. And at the time, that was California's worst wildfire in its history. And I ended up getting back to New York and researching and seeing how wildfires were being fueled by climate change. And that made me really want to do something, because I love my home. I love the people in it, the animals, the biodiversity in it. And so I ended up taking all of the emotions I was feeling, the climate anxiety and eco-grief, and I decided to join the Fridays for Future movement. And I started striking every single Friday in front of the United Nations headquarters in December of 2018. And I did that for over a year, every single Friday.
Yeah. And I heard you speak at a Climate Week event in New York, and we established what year was that? 2019
Yep.
at the top floor of Salesforce Tower and across from Bryant Park, and wow, I was like, I didn't know we were going to be doing this conversation. I didn't know you, but it's like, wow. I mean, this is amazing to hear how well-spoken you and I think some other young people were on this, and really opened my eyes to the fact that, you know, so much of the conversations that we adults and companies in particular have with young people, it's a little bit, I would say, you know, maybe a little condescending, or let's invite them in, and let's, you know, the cute kid act or something like that. So you've been working with Salesforce for a few years. Talk a little about what you're doing and how that happened, and why Salesforce.
Yeah, of course. So I ended up meeting people from Salesforce when I first got involved in the climate movement. They're one of the first businesses that I started talking to, I remember. And I think that at the time it was really nice to have a conversation with a business in more of a how can we support you tone. And I think that that's been the tone from the very beginning, is how can we support the youth climate movement. And so I really appreciate that. And now I think it's really important for businesses to be taking action, because I've gone to the World Economic Forum. I've been to 2 of them before, and I've seen more action from businesses at the World Economic Forum than I have at COP or from governments. And so businesses are so important and key to getting the action that we need. And so with Salesforce specifically, Earth Uprising is using Salesforce technology. My organization, Earth Uprising, is using Salesforce technology for our back-end system. And I think it's really important to be doing that step, because there hasn't been another youth climate organization that's done that. And we've seen with how technology has supported the youth climate movement grow. And so I'm really excited to see how using this technology also helps us continue to organize and make much more of a difference too.
Yeah. So Patrick, bring you into the picture here. I mean, you know, as we said, you know, companies often engage with youth culture in a sort of a tokenized way. And how is that? How do you approach it in a way where it doesn't feel that way?
Yeah. Well, I think at Salesforce we think so much about all of our stakeholders, everyone around us, sure, customers, shareholders, the planet is a key stakeholder, and the communities we live and work in, including the youth within them, is an important stakeholder to our process. We're also a company built on our values. We've got trust, customer success, innovation, equality, and this year sustainability added as our fifth value. Also, not in a tokenized way when we talk about our values. These are things that we look to everyone in the company to try to figure out, how do we get where we want to go? How do we think about our values as the navigational tool on our journey forward? And for me, leading sustainability, I work for planet Earth. And I know that business is the greatest platform for change. And in order to use it in service of a planet that doesn't know how to scream more loudly for help than everything we're seeing all around us, everywhere, we need to think about how it's first and foremost about equality. It's those with the least who suffer the most when climate change goes wrong, but there's also an intergenerational equality at play here where, as Paul Hawken would say, we're stealing from the future, selling it in the present, and calling it gross domestic product. We are pulling resources from the future, pulling a vibrant future from the next generation. And they see that, they feel that in a deep way that I don't. And so listening to them, elevating their voices has always been a really helpful way to inform our strategy.
So what does this relationship do? I know that, Salesforce has, 1% of your product you donate, and there's those programs. But how does this help Salesforce, or is that not how you look at it? What does this relationship do at your end?
It's a couple of things. One is this idea of community. I know that's so central to this Verge experience here. There's a community effect, and in order to build an authentic community, learning from one another, learning from different perspectives, you need to have an inclusive approach and bring in the voices that might be overlooked. The second thing, to me, it's every time I hear Alexandria speak, it's like a injection of the need to be bold. They like I said, the younger generation looks at the year 2050 in a completely different way than I ever will. And all of us can fall victim to thinking a little bit too day to day. All of us, no matter how deeply we understand the urgency of this moment, it can be tempting to get through your inbox, can be tempting to just put one foot in front of the other in a given day, focus on incremental progress, and we cannot do that. We need every leader out there to aim big, aim for exponential change, and listening to the younger generation, to me, sort of charges that part of the battery that inspires me to try to swing big.
Yeah. Alexandria, let's talk a little bit about how you show up to a company, what you've learned about there, and what you like to see from a company in terms of how they show up with you. What have you learned, not just with Salesforce, but I'm sure that there have been others. This is not your first rodeo here.
Yeah, I think that one of the first things I noticed when starting to work with businesses and companies was there was very much so this politics of professionalism, where it felt like youth had to show up to the table and talk the same way they were. We had to communicate in the same way, and it kind of took away from what we were really pushing for. And I think that it's important for businesses and companies when working with youth to realize the differences in the ways that we organize. We're talking in ways of the bold action that we need, what we need to do for planet. And sometimes businesses come in and they talk about, well, what they only think they can do. And so it's important to first understand that relationship, but then also the conversation when you engage with a young person, it doesn't just end after that. Thank you so much for what you're doing. You give me hope for the future. The conversation needs to continue after that, and constantly being engaging, especially around when we have global conferences that are coming up like COP and other spaces that are so influential like that. It's important to continue the conversation with youth.
Well, let's talk about that conversation. What is it about? What do you want it to be about? What does it need to be about?
I think that there's a couple different things. I think, first of all, youth bring a different perspective to the table. And the reason why is because when we get into these conversations with businesses, we think outside of the box that a lot of adults have been ingrained in. And they think inside the system, but youth come in and we think outside of it. And so some ways that youth have been engaged is, for example, companies have created youth councils. So the foundation side of IKEA, Inca, has created a youth council that I'm a part of as well. And one thing that we've done with them is we've had conversations with them about their supply chain, about their phase 1, 2, and 3, and so talking about more the way that they are working as a company and what they need to change. And I think that when you bring youth into the conversation, you need to get to that. You need to really get into it instead of just talking about the surface level. We're taking action.
Yeah, Patrick, what's the conversation you think other companies should be having, and what have you learned about in the conversations you've had with Alexandria and others?
I think every company should be thinking about the voices that they elevate and the platform that they can provide. So whether it's us at a Dreamforce conference or World Tour, or at a different event trying to make sure we have an inclusive environment, more voices, and bring the full community together. That's one thing everybody can do, because as much as your company might sell shoes or software or whatever, you also are a platform, a brand, and some place where you can elevate different voices. I think that's probably the biggest way that everybody can plug in and take action.
And are there particular topics, because we keep talking about the conversation, and I said, well, still trying to get to this, what does it want to be about? What are the kinds of questions that each of you might show up at that conversation with? Let's start with you, Alexandria.
Well, first of all, the main thing I look for in companies is what they're doing for scope 1, 2, and 3. I think that's really important to talk about, because I think that sometimes we just focus on the first and second scope, and we don't really go into the third scope. And I think that youth also, when we go into that conversation, we bring that idea of what they can be doing for scope 3 instead. I also think that when it comes to elevating voices, ways that you can do that is create a spot for them in your rooms, but also funding them and giving them the spaces to go and be in more of those decision-making rooms as well.
Well, I mean, I just want to drill into this a little bit, and then I want to go to sidebar, make sure we get a question in a minute. So, scope 1, 2, and 3, sure, we're doing our scope 1, and we'll get to scope 3. We'll plan by 2030 to have whatever. What do you do with that information? How does that change or affect what you then talk about?
Well, I think that it really just starts on finding out that information, because you'd be surprised how many companies don't even look at that information. And so I think it's important for companies to get that data. And also one thing, I started working with this company that started measuring the emissions of companies, and a lot of companies actually only check once a year how much they're emitting. And I think that that's also something that companies need to look towards, is how much are you emitting year round? Don't just check this data once a year. Check it constantly to see how you can change it.
Are you sure you're not a sales rep for their net zero cloud? Yeah. So Patrick, what are some of the questions, the things that you like to bring to the table that you make sure that you can learn or ask?
Yeah, when about a year ago, Salesforce put out our climate action plan, which in addition to having the rolled up data around scope 1, 2, 3 and bold commitments and accelerating our journey to net zero now, 100% renewable now, we also turned it forwards and started being really clear about what we see the future road out to 2030 to look like, the places where we have the answers, the places where we're stuck. And I think there's a moment here where being transparent, even about the places where each of us is stuck around all of scope 1, 2, 3 out to 2030, is sort of a breakthrough that this community needs to become comfortable with. It's not shameful to be stuck in some places. It's a moment to share that and swarm and collaborate. And so in creating that climate action plan, we socialized it, and we went through this process of looking from the lens of 2030 backwards. So again, this idea that looking from the future, including looking from the eyes of a somebody of the younger generation forces you to be bold. We would ask ourselves the question, in 2030, what will the sustainable travel program, the sustainable cloud program, the sustainable supply chain program need to look like then to be in the lead, and what do we need to do now to set in motion the things that'll get us there?
Yeah.
And that experiment, it's exactly in line with this conversation of looking at things through the eyes of your future self, and in some ways even better than that is to look at it from the future, from the vantage point of somebody who's in the younger generation.
Yeah, great. Deanna, do you have a question for Patrick and Alexandria?
Yes, we do. Lee is actually going to ask.
Oh, Leah.
the question.
Okay. Hi, Leah.
Come on, Joel. So as a self-diagnosed, chronically cynical person, I hear conversations like these and I want to feel so uplifted and hopeful, but how can I know that a company is really listening to incredible people like Alexandria Villaseñor, who, by the way, I'm a really big fan.
Yeah. So, Alexandria, how do you tell if a company's actually listening?
Well, first of all, I don't want you to listen to a conversation like this and feel hopeful and uplifted. I want you to go away with thinking about what we can constantly do more. And then I think that the way that I know a company is listening is that they continue engaging with us. I mean, I've been ghosted by companies. They'll say, we'll support you, and then they won't respond. So I think that the way that I see companies are listening is first they engage, but then they also actually show us what they're doing, because it's important that they don't just say words, they actually take action.
Yeah, you know, the relationship matters, right? Very Salesforce-y CRM company, but really the longevity, the consistency of the relationship, really listening to what you need help with and being there, making the connections. If we can provide it with technology or financially, great. If not, we've got a whole network of people who share our values and making sure that we can put you in the right hands.
We've got just a minute left, and I want to ask you, give the last question to you, Alexandria. I hear people talk a lot about allyship. And what does that mean to you, and what does that look like in the context of these kinds of conversations?
I think that allyship, the way that I've always looked to it is people who are a fan of the youth climate movement, and what I mean by that is anyone can be a fan of it, and that is fund, amplify, and narrate. So first of all, within the climate movement, there's a lot of youth who are being impacted by the climate crisis, but their voices aren't the ones being amplified. It's only the people who can travel and go to those places that we hear from. So fund youth, get them to the places, get their voices heard, amplify our voices, and then also narrate. Everybody's own climate story is so important, how everyone is being impacted, why it's important that we're taking action. I want you all to share your own stories and why it's important that companies should be taking action.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Patrick, I love what you're saying about we need to judge ourselves from the future. I mean, I think that's something that I hadn't thought about till I heard you say that the other day, and I think that's something we all need to be thinking more about: is how do we judge what we're doing, from 2030, or whatever, pick your date. And Alexandria, you are the future, and we need you to hold Patrick, all of us, to account for that future that you will hopefully thrive and abundant and be able to enjoy as we have ours. So thank you so much for being here. Please join me in thanking Alexandria and Patrick.